Welcome back to another episode of Riding with Mr. Ruckdashel. Today is episode 14. Who's that? Pronouns. And today I kind of thought that it would be important for us to consider what pronouns we're using and kind of how often we're using them as part of our editing process. Get those drums out. Here we go. Like I said before, blue lines on a white paper. No blank papers. All right, so big idea here is that writers make sure readers don't get confused by pronouns. That's the big thing. We don't want something getting in the way of our reader continuing with our story and understanding what's going on. I'm sure all of you know how difficult it can be sometimes to understand what a story is talking about or to follow along, and that's even when pronouns are used correctly. So we want to do the best we can to make it easy for our reader. So here are some examples of pronouns: he, she, it, they, them, and those are the common ones that we might be using in our story. So we're going to take a look real quickly at my story, and we're going to see some examples of where I think I actually could have not used my character's name and used a pronoun. And that's going to be sort of the main stuff for me that you'll notice as far as pronoun use. So let's start from the beginning. David's stomach felt empty as he walked slowly out of Mr. Simmons' office. Pausing for a moment, David stared out the window. Okay, so already, we know this is David. So I don't think I need to repeat David. So I'm going to exit out of the big old window, and I'm going to do some editing. So I'm going to make, instead of David, I'm going to say he stared out the window. And we're going to keep going. The days were getting shorter, and already it seemed close to dark outside. How long had he been in there? Had he already missed afternoon recess? Shadows stretched toward him, long and thin. And you notice I didn't say anything about the he's we already had. Those aren't confusing because we haven't talked about any character recently. So that's not going to be something our reader's going to be like, wait, what he is he talking about? We know it's David. One almost looked like his mother when she was in one of her moods. Hand on hip, wagging that finger of hers at him. Okay. Now this, because they're different genders, is not a problem. Now if it was hand on hip, wagging that finger of his at him, that would be confusing. But since we're talking about a female, mom, and David, him, no problem. What are my parents going to say? He thought. So, again, since he's our main character, we only get to know his thoughts, so that's not a problem. Mr. Simmons' advice had seemed easy enough in David's head, but he doubted the populars would bother with it. So, I think that there's an argument to be made that this he that's used right there, there's a possibility that someone could be a little confused by it, but I tend to think that it's fine. Mr. Simmons, we haven't really had any issues with, so I would prefer to leave it that way. And I say issues with as in he's not really in the scene currently. I mean, we kind of left the office, so we know Mr. Simmons isn't there. David's footsteps echoed down the hall, crashing into his brain. He felt alone. He wished someone would choose what to do for him. Looking down the hallway in front of him, it was abandoned. His footsteps seemed to get louder in his mind as he walked down the hall. What do I do? What choice is right? Okay, I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit to the point where there's actually someone else involved. Because until that time, there really isn't a point where, there's any issues going on with name usage and using pronouns. So I'm going to start right down here at by the time. By the time David had trudged across the field, the draft was finishing. David, what are you doing? Yelled Quentin. You're on our team. Jimmy was standing there looking around, waiting to be given instruction. He'd expected things to change after our crew had been taken to the office and hadn't counted on further rejection. Okay, I think that that's an example where we're not quite sure He'd expected things to change after our crew. Now, it says our crew. Argument could be made again, I think, to where you could leave it, but I think it would be more clear if we said something like, waiting to be given further instruction. Jimmy must have expected things to change after our crew had been taken to the office and hadn't counted on further rejection. Just say something to Jimmy about him being on our team. And so I put that in italics, so it's obviously a thought, although I think it would make sense for that to be a separate paragraph. I missed that the other day. Turning and running, David yelled. Okay, so had to make sure it was David, because if I said he there, it could be Jimmy or David. Quentin was standing there with the football in his hand, waiting, stretching back and forth, impatient. Clouds of dust kicked up as David arrived in their end zone, and the ball was tossed up to him. Turning back around to kick, he paused. Don't say anything about Jimmy. Don't say anything. Okay, so we had some uses of pronouns where it was the ball was tossed up to him, and he paused. But these are all in the same paragraph as David arriving in the end zone, and I think it's pretty clear who we're talking about. So now I'm in the first part of the purple. The next thing that happened wasn't planned. David didn't choose to do it. The words seemed to just fall out of, again, I think when this is another instance where I use David again, and I don't need to. I could just say the words just seem to fall out of his mouth and then hung in the air. Maybe Jimmy can be on our team. Notice that I didn't put a dialogue tag with this. Because I already say that Jimmy is the one who's going to be using these words, it's obvious enough to me that this can just be said. And I think it's better for the flow and for the rhythm of our story if we don't have a dialogue tag. Sometimes those just get in the way. Kids yelled. David tapped his toes back and forth in the dust. He looked at Quentin and then looked away. Quentin hadn't moved. He hadn't given a hint of anything or having heard anything. Okay, so notice that I say he looked to Quentin and then looked away. So here, I could say he hadn't moved. He hadn't given a hint of everything, having heard anything. But I do think it's possible people might think that I was talking about David. So we want to leave this one to make sure we know we're talking about Quentin. And then here, I can go ahead and say he, because now we're talking about Quentin, obviously. David turned to kick the ball off. Reaching his arm back, he took his regular steps. We're seeing more pronouns. Okay. So that's about all I need to talk about. I don't want to keep saying the same thing over and over and wasting a bunch of your time, because your time is super valuable. So let's take a look at our next page here, and it's our to-do list. So here's what you should do. Reread your whole story, revising through one lens. Pronouns. Do they work here? Is it obvious which character you're referring to? Would it be less wordy and awkward to replace a name with a pronoun? Those are questions you should consider as you're reading. So this will be probably a pretty slow read, and you might do this just on your first read through to where you take it little bit by little bit. And it might take all of like 20 minutes tops, depending on how long your story is, to do this read through. And you're just going to be making little tiny changes. All right. Hey, that's it. Episode 14. Who's that? Who is that? Oh, who is that? Just kidding. I know. My dad jokes. They're irresistibly funny. Almost as funny now as they are in the Zoom. So, hey, everyone, take care. Just as I always say, stay healthy, stay safe, and make sure you take a little bit of time, carve some out from your day to think about these pronouns in your stories. We only have 2 lessons left this week, and those are going to finish up our stories for us. Remember, our next Zoom is Thursday, 10 a.m. And after that, the following week, we'll be moving into history, and everything will be graded. How exciting is that? I know, I can't wait either. Yes! All right, peace.